Yeah, that's the first thing I wanted to do was introductions. I figured everyone could go around and say their name, what affiliation they're with, and their relevant experience to the topic.
Okay.
I figured we could go like alphabetically by last name, which means you would actually be first, Professor Ballesteros, last name. So.
All right, so I work at George Washington University. I'm in the faculty of the business school. I teach international business, and I have been studying for the past 6-7 years business responses to disasters, and this includes philanthropic giving in the aftermath of natural disasters. And before joining academia, I worked for an investment bank, and I was also part of the United Nations before the financial sector. And while at the United Nations, I was related with disaster management.
Hi, I'm Sandrina. I am with GlobalGiving. I'm a crisis response specialist. I joined GlobalGiving here this past December. Before then, I did a very short stint with the humanitarian team at Interaction. And most of my time, my professional experience before coming to DC was actually in different field-based positions. I was working on humanitarian response and protection of civilians with national NGOs, international NGOs, and also the UN peacekeeping missions. And I've done that both in different African contexts as well as in Asia.
Okay, my name is Ferris. It's good to be with you all. I teach at Georgetown University. I was at Brookings for about 10 years where I worked on issues of internal displacement. And really since the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami have looked a lot at the relationship between disasters and human rights and what humanitarians can do. And before that, I worked for about 20 years in the humanitarian sector. Glad to be with you.
The first question I wanted to bring to the panel today was, what is the impact of natural disasters on human rights, and are there variations of this impact? If so, why? And I think, Dr. Ferris, you are the person I'd like to answer this first, if that's okay.
Sure. I think traditionally, natural disasters we're seeing as primarily areas for strong logistical response of moving in food, medicine, water, et cetera. But since the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, there's been growing awareness about the human rights dimensions of disasters at every stage. Before the disaster occurs in terms of how preparations are made, early warning systems, et cetera. In the immediate aftermath of a disaster, we've learned that there are all kinds of human rights issues that come up having to do with the distribution of assistance, sexual gender-based violence, discrimination that occurs, often unwittingly by humanitarian actors. And then over the longer term, what happens when people are displaced after a disaster for months or years, and a different set of human rights issues kick in, with the passage of time. So I just think being aware of human rights at every stage of the disaster process, whether it's a sudden onset disaster or slow one such as drought, is really important for humanitarians. And happy to talk more about any of these issues.
Okay.
Thank you so much for getting us started, Dr. Ferris, and I've read a number of papers and a lot of your work. I guess the only thing I would just also highlight is what happens particularly when you have a sudden onset, a natural disaster in a situation where you have conflict, so where you turn into and have these complex emergencies, and it's just it really exacerbates an already difficult situation on the ground, and so that brings in either a new set of challenges, or also really magnifies exponentially what the crisis is already happening on the ground.
Interesting. So then how does aid then affect all of these intersections that both of you have highlighted so well?
Frequently, as I said, aid is distributed in ways that can actually exacerbate some of the human rights issues. For example, I've seen cases where aid workers have distributed aid, not realizing that they're privileging one particular ethnic group, or in case of South Asia, one particular caste, sometimes because it's people who happen to speak English or one of the European languages. And, so sometimes the aid is given on a discriminatory basis. Sometimes it isn't adequate, it's not accessible. Sometimes there are gender components to the way aid is distributed. We saw after Haiti, for example, distribution of rice in very heavy bags, which meant that it was hard for women to carry them. Even when aid is distributed to women and heads of household, I think that that's now the general practice. Sometimes in Haiti, and women will walk around the corner and there'd be a bunch of guys there ready to take the sack of rice from her. So, but I think you just have to be aware of these issues and to build in measures to make sure that aid is getting to those who most need it.
And I'll highlight one of the ways that we tackle that at GlobalGiving, which is that we work with over 4,000 nonprofit partners all over the world. And so when we have situations, natural disasters, and there's two, I guess, complex emergencies that we work on, at least in a derivative manner, both for the Syrian refugee crisis and also Rohingya. But in the case of Haiti or Nepal, or even now Guatemala since last Sunday, where we are working directly with local organizations and sometimes NGOs as well, and sometimes they're headed by women, local leaders. And so it really helps us to see the different dimensions of a disaster being taken up by communities who, are well aware of the issues, the challenge, the, potentially existing ethnic or, other complexities that is not always so obvious, or, especially in the haze, in the aftermath of a natural hazard where, you have people coming in and who aren't as familiar or who are mobilizing and deploying aid in a way that, they've done and, in some ways successful in certain areas, but, that is not adapted to the local context. And so we find that, it makes it very effective for us to work directly with these organizations that we've had relationships with for years.
Yeah, wow, thank you so much. I guess so then the kind of inherent follow-up question coming up here is then why is it so difficult for some aid organizations as opposed to others to protect human rights versus those who inadvertently will promote systems that violate them in the aftermath of disaster?
Yeah, I'm not sure who that is directed to, but I might chime in. I think something that happens is when you have a large scale, high media coverage, natural disasters, you have a lot of brand new actors who come in. And we can talk later about the business component, but you have a lot of community groups and others who have the best of intentions and want to do the right thing. And sometimes just don't realize that, the aid community has developed certain ways of working, which for good reasons. For example, there are a lot of donations of in-kind items. I mean, I've seen a lot of community groups in the U.S. who, in the bottom of their heart, they organize drives, they collect stuffed animals or old clothes or whatever, and they ship them off. And, that's just not considered good practice within the humanitarian sector. I mean, often the items that arrive aren't what people need or not what they need.
Yeah, and I guess something else that I would add is organizations that get formed right after a disaster happens because there is aid, there are resources, and so then you have these new actors that are just getting started. They're potentially not being plugged into the coordination mechanisms, whether that's the cluster system or otherwise. And so, you might have them, going off in certain directions and perhaps, not being as plugged in, as clued into what the actual, coordination structures have deemed as priorities. I think something else that happens is that certain areas potentially get, because there's easier access, and specifically for complex emergencies. And so it just becomes easier to reach certain groups, certain communities as opposed to others. And that could be for a myriad of reasons. those communities that are perceived as being given preference and also become, I guess, a part of the response, that can also bring up all sorts of a host of other challenges for the response that ensues, and also for the dynamics within that community.